The sky had the color of dirty steel, low and heavy, like it might collapse onto the earth at any moment. Private Mikhail Sokolov hated skies like that. They meant artillery. They meant sound traveling farther than it should. They meant death coming before you heard it. He adjusted the strap of the radio pack, digging into his shoulders, and kept walking. Ahead of him, Sergeant Anton Lebedev raised a fist. The small column of 7 men stopped immediately, boots crunching in the thin crust of frozen mud. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Silence had become instinct on this front. To their left, the remains of a village slumped into the earth. Chimneys without houses, doors hanging from nothing, black beams clawing at the sky. Snow gathered in the ruins like ash. Checkpoint should be past that ridge, Lebedev muttered, not turning around. Command wants the station up before dark. Sokolov glanced at the others. Yuri, the youngest, lips pale, radio coils wrapped around his neck like some metal scarf. Grigory, former schoolteacher, now assistant operator, glasses cracked but still worn. Boris and Stepan, infantry escorts, rifles always ready, eyes always scanning. Nikolai, mechanic, antenna specialist, hands permanently blackened with grease. And at the rear, limping slightly, was Captain Alexei Morozov. Morozov was the reason they were out here. Division Command needed a forward communications relay to coordinate an upcoming offensive. Fast-moving units had outrun cable lines. Radios were the only lifeline, so they sent a mobile team. They sent them. Move, Lebedev said. They crossed the ridge. On the other side, the world ended. Smoke columns rose in the far distance. The horizon flickered with dull flashes. Artillery, constant and indifferent. The wind carried the distant rumble like a storm that never arrived. But the road they were meant to follow was empty. Too empty. Morozov stepped forward, studying the map again. His jaw tightened. They were supposed to be here, he said quietly. No trucks. No infantry screen. No signal flares. Just wind pushing snow across abandoned tire tracks. Sokolov felt it then, that slow, creeping sensation in the stomach soldiers never named out loud. Something had gone wrong. A dull boom rolled across the plain, closer than before. Then another. Boris turned sharply. That's not ours. Lebedev didn't hesitate. Village. Now. They ran. Not in formation. Not orderly. Just men with heavy equipment stumbling through snow toward the nearest cover. The first shells landed as they reached the ruins. Earth erupted behind them. Shrapnel hissed through broken wood. Sokolov threw himself through the doorway of a house that no longer had walls. The bombardment lasted less than 2 minutes. It felt like an hour. When it stopped, the world rang. Dust drifted through the air. Something burned nearby. Yuri was coughing violently. Nikolai was laughing, not because anything was funny, but because his nerves had nowhere else to go. Morozov wiped blood from a cut on his forehead. That wasn't random, he said. They're ranging the road. Lebedev peered through a shattered window frame. His voice was flat. They've broken through. No one asked where. They all knew what that meant. The front line had shifted, and they were now on the wrong side of it. They found the cellar by accident. Grigory nearly fell through the rotten boards covering the entrance. Beneath was a cramped underground storage room, half collapsed but dry. Morozov made the decision immediately. We set up here. Lebedev stared at him. Sir, we're cut off. All the more reason, Morozov replied. Command needs eyes and ears. If we move, we run into patrols. Here, we might last. Might. That word hung in the air. They worked quickly. Nikolai assembled the field transmitter. Sokolov and Yuri checked the vacuum tubes. Grigory logged frequencies with shaking hands. The infantrymen fortified entrances with debris. Above them, the wind howled through broken streets. By dusk, they powered the set. Static filled the cellar, loud, alive, like the ocean trapped in a metal box. Sokolov adjusted the dial. Nothing. No friendly traffic. No artillery coordination. No command channel. Just noise. Morozov tried again at scheduled intervals. Still nothing. Finally, Lebedev said what they were all thinking. They don't know we're here. Morozov looked at the dark ceiling. No, he said quietly. They think we're gone. That night, they took turns on watch. No fires. No lights. The cold seeped into bone and thought alike. Around midnight, Stepan hissed from the stairs. Movement. Everyone froze. Boots crunched outside. Voices. Not Russian. A patrol passed through the village, silhouettes moving across the moonlit snow. One soldier paused near the house. Sokolov held his breath, so long his chest burned. The man spat, adjusted his rifle, and moved on. They waited an hour before anyone spoke again. "We're behind their line," Yuri whispered. No one corrected him, because he was right. And somewhere out there, the battle kept moving, without them. Morning brought a truth harder than the cold. The radio still couldn't reach command. But now, they could hear the enemy. Clear transmissions, coordinated movements, supply requests, artillery spotting. They were sitting in the middle of a corridor the enemy was actively using. Invisible, forgotten, alone. Morozov stared at the radio set for a long time. Then he said the words that would seal all their fates. "Keep listening." The enemy voices became part of the air they breathed. At first the men flinched every time German speech crackled through the headset, as if sound alone could betray their position. But hours turned into a full day, and the cellar remained undiscovered. Fear slowly changed shape. It did not disappear. It settled, heavy and constant, like the cold. Sokolov kept the headphones on so long his ears ached. He wrote everything down. Call signs, grid references, supply routes, artillery corrections. Most of it meant little in isolation, but together it formed a picture, a massive movement west to east. An offensive, and not a small one. Captain Morozov crouched beside him, unshaven, eyes red from lack of sleep. "Again," he said quietly. Sokolov replayed the last intercept from memory. Fuel columns, assault guns, infantry regrouping near the river crossing 20 kilometers south. "They're not defending," Grigori whispered. "They're preparing to strike." Above them, distant artillery rumbled, not continuous like before, but spaced, deliberate. Preparatory fire. Lebedev turned from the cellar stairs. "Patrols are increasing. I counted 3 this morning." Morozov nodded slowly. Pieces were locking into place in his mind, and he didn't like the picture forming. If the Germans were preparing a major counterattack, it meant one thing. Soviet forces nearby were overextended, advancing, vulnerable, and they had no idea what was coming. "We have to send this," Yuri said. Everyone looked at the radio. Nikolai didn't. He was already shaking his head. "The main transmitter's unstable," he muttered. "Vacuum tube is cracked. We push full power, it burns out. Maybe explodes." "How long to fix it?" Morozov asked. Nikolai gave a humorless smile. "With a workshop? 2 hours. Here? With frozen tools and scrap wire?" He held up his blackened fingers. "Maybe never." Silence filled the cellar. Outside, a truck engine growled somewhere in the village, then faded. Grigori swallowed. "If we don't send it." Morozov finished the sentence for him. "Thousands die without knowing why." No one argued. They worked anyway. Nikolai dismantled the transmitter with the care of a surgeon. Sokolov held a flashlight between his teeth, shielding the beam with his hand. Yuri sorted spare parts that didn't quite match, but might, with luck, function. Grigori rewound damaged coils using copper strands stripped from ruined wiring upstairs. Every sound felt too loud. Every dropped screw froze their blood. By afternoon, snow began to fall, thick, heavy flakes that swallowed noise and turned the ruined village into a white graveyard. Lebedev came down the stairs once, face tight. Armored vehicles moving on the east road. At least a company. Morozov didn't look up. "Good," he said. Lebedev frowned. "Good? Means they're focused forward," Morozov replied. "Not on ghosts behind them." Ghosts. That's what they were becoming. Invisible men in a dead village, listening to an army march. The breakthrough came at dusk. Nikolai sat back suddenly, breath fogging in the freezing air. "It might hold," he said. "Might?" Yuri echoed. "It'll burn out after transmission," Nikolai clarified. "1 shot. Maybe 2 minutes before it fries." 2 minutes. Sokolov stared at the headphones. He had pages of notes now, coordinates circled in pencil, arrows connecting movements. Enough to change everything, if it reached command. Morozov made the decision. "We transmit at 0200. Lowest patrol activity. Highest atmospheric skip." He looked at each of them. "Once we send, they triangulate. We'll have minutes before artillery." No one asked what happened after that. They all understood. Night came like a lid closing. The men ate their last shared ration of bread and horse fat in silence. Yuri crossed himself. Grigori wrote a few lines in a small notebook he kept hidden in his coat. Boris cleaned his rifle slowly, methodically, hands steady for the first time all day. Sokolov checked the frequency again. Still enemy traffic. Orders being issued. Units moving into assault positions. The attack would begin at dawn, which meant their warning had to go now. 1:58. Morozov nodded. Do it. Nikolai flipped the power switch. The transmitter hummed, louder than before, tubes glowing an angry orange. Sokolov tuned the dial with shaking fingers, searching through static for any Soviet command frequency still alive. Nothing. Then, a faint carrier wave. Weak. Distant. Sokolov grabbed the key. This is forward relay station. His voice cracked. He swallowed and started again, forcing calm. This is forward relay station Volga, 7. Emergency transmission. Priority red. Static roared. Then, barely audible. Receiving, signal weak, identify. Sokolov nearly laughed with relief. He read coordinates first. Then, enemy unit strengths. Tank concentrations. Artillery placements. Attack timing. He did not rush. Every word had to be clear. Behind him, Nikolai stared at the transmitter, sweat freezing on his forehead. The casing was beginning to smoke. Outside, a distant engine revved. Headlights flickered between broken buildings. They heard us, Lebedev said. Morozov drew his pistol. Finish it. Sokolov reached the final line. Major armored thrust at dawn. Repeat, dawn assault. Prepare defensive positions immediately. In transmission. The transmitter screamed. A bright spark snapped inside the casing. The lights died. Silence crashed into the cellar. Then came the sound they had all expected. Whistling. Incoming artillery. Down, Lebedev shouted. The first shell obliterated the house above them. The ceiling collapsed in a storm of dust and splinters. The second hit the street outside, shattering what remained of the walls. Snow, earth, and fire poured into the cellar entrance. Yuri was thrown across the room. Grigory screamed, clutching his arm. The air filled with smoke and powdered brick. But through the chaos, Morozov grabbed Sokolov's shoulder. Did it go through? Sokolov coughed, ears ringing. Yes, he rasped. Morozov closed his eyes for just a second. Then he turned toward the stairs, where German voices were already shouting in the night. Positions, he said calmly. Above them, boots pounded through rubble. The ghosts had spoken, and now the world had come to erase them. The first German soldier through the doorway never saw who shot him. Boris fired from the shadow beside the collapsed stairwell. Muzzle flashed briefly, turning the cellar into a strobe of white and black. The soldier fell backward into the snow, rifle clattering across broken stone. Another figure shouted outside. Then gunfire ripped through the shattered walls. Dust rained from the ceiling. Fall back to the inner wall. Lebedev ordered. The cellar was no longer a hiding place. It was a trap. Chunks of burning timber slid down the stairwell, lighting the entrance with flickering orange. Smoke rolled in thick waves, turning every breath into a fight. Nikolai dragged the dead transmitter aside and overturned a table for cover. Sokolov pulled Yuri behind a stack of crates just as bullets tore through the wood where he had been sitting seconds earlier. Morozov fired once up the stairwell, then twice more, slow, controlled shots. Not panic, not rage, just delay. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to last. Outside, engines roared closer. Not trucks. Half-tracks. The metallic grind of tracks over stone vibrated through the floor like distant thunder. A flare burst overhead, turning the ruined village into a landscape of harsh white light and black shadows. They brought armor, Stepan muttered. Good, Lebedev replied grimly. Means we mattered. Another explosion slammed into the house, collapsing what remained of the roof. Snow and embers poured down like a storm of sparks. The shockwave punched the air from Sokolov's lungs. Yuri clutched his side. Blood seeped through his fingers. I'm okay, he lied. Morozov crawled to him, pressed a bandage into the wound without ceremony. Stay awake, he said quietly. Above them, German voices barked orders. Boots circled the building. One soldier tossed a grenade through the doorway. Grenade. Lebedev kicked it back with savage precision. The blast outside was followed by screams. But the return fire intensified immediately. They were surrounded. Minutes blurred into fragments of sound and movement. Boris was hit first, a round through the shoulder that spun him into the wall. He kept firing one-handed until his rifle clicked empty. Stepan took his place without a word. Grigory, glasses shattered, fed ammunition from a crate while whispering numbers under his breath like a prayer. Nikolai used a broken pipe as a club when a German soldier dropped through the smoke. striking with desperate strength before collapsing beside the doorway. The cellar filled with cordite and dust. Ears rang constantly. The world narrowed to the next breath, the next shot. Morozov checked his watch. For minutes since the artillery began. If command had received the signal, units would be scrambling now. Radios lighting up. Officers waking exhausted soldiers. Artillery batteries turning guns. But that future existed far away. Here, time was measured in heartbeats. A machine gun opened up from the street, chewing through the wall. Stone exploded inward. Stepan fell without a sound. Lebedev dragged him back, checked his pulse once, then took his ammunition. No words. No time. Back room. Morozov ordered. They retreated deeper into the cellar as the front half of the building collapsed under sustained fire. The rear wall bowed inward from the concussion of another shell. Snow poured through cracks in the ceiling. Sokolov helped Yuri crawl behind a fallen beam. "You should leave me," Yuri said through chattering teeth. Sokolov didn't answer. He just handed him a pistol. A loudspeaker crackled outside in accented Russian. "Surrender. You are surrounded. Come out with hands up." Lebedev laughed hoarsely. "They always say that." Morozov looked at his remaining men. Sokolov, Yuri, Nikolai, Grigory, Lebedev, 5. From 7. He nodded once. "Negative," he called back in German. Gunfire answered. The final assault came fast. Grenades blasted the rear wall inward. German infantry rushed through smoke and snow, shapes more than men. Lebedev met them with controlled bursts, dropping 2 before a bullet struck his chest. He slid down the wall, still trying to raise his rifle. Nikolai tackled another attacker, both vanishing into the smoke in a brutal tangle of limbs and steel. Sokolov fired until his rifle locked back. A figure loomed through the haze. He pulled the trigger anyway, empty clicks echoing uselessly. Then Morozov's pistol barked beside his ear, and the figure fell. Grigory was shouting something, coordinates, numbers, maybe just fear, when a blast threw him across the cellar. He didn't move again. The room was shrinking, filling with smoke and falling debris. Morozov grabbed Sokolov by the collar and dragged him toward a narrow coal chute half buried in rubble. "Out," he said. "What about? Out." Sokolov pulled Yuri with him. The chute led into a drainage ditch behind the house, clogged with snow but open enough to crawl. Bullets snapped overhead as they emerged into the freezing night. Behind them, the cellar exploded in a roar of fire. Morozov never came out. They crawled until their arms stopped working. The village burned behind them, orange against the low clouds. German voices shouted, but none followed far into the open fields. The storm had returned, snow swallowing tracks within minutes. Yuri collapsed first. "I can't," he whispered. Sokolov dragged him into a shallow depression and covered him with a torn blanket. He listened for engines, for dogs, for anything. Nothing. Only wind. And far away artillery. Not German. Soviet guns. Hundreds of them. The horizon pulsed with distant flashes, a rolling thunder that did not stop. Sokolov looked back at the burning village one last time. "They heard us," he said. Yuri managed a faint smile. Then the guns grew louder, and the ground trembled as a new battle began, one the enemy had not expected, one they had warned about. Hours later, at dawn, Soviet tanks rolled through the sector the Germans had planned to attack. But instead of surprise, they met prepared defenses, massed artillery, and ambush positions already waiting. The counteroffensive broke before it began. No one on that battlefield knew why their commanders had been ready. No one knew about the cellar, the transmitter, the men who had chosen to speak knowing it would be their last act. History would record the battle. It would never record the signal. The battlefield was quiet in the way only battlefields can be, not truly silent, but emptied of intent. Snow drifted across burned-out vehicles and shattered artillery pieces. Smoke rose in thin, tired columns. The earth was black where explosions had melted the frost, then frozen it again into glassy scars. Sergeant Mikhail Sokolov woke to the sound of crows. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. The sky above him was pale and endless. His eyelashes were crusted with ice. His hands were numb around the strap of the empty radio pack he still wore like a reflex. Then memory returned in a single, crushing wave. The cellar, the signal, the fire. "Yuri," he croaked. Beside him, half buried under snow, Yuri Petrov didn't move. Sokolov already knew. He sat there for a long time, the wind whispering over the frozen fields, until distant engines broke the stillness. Not the deep rumble of German armor. Lighter. Familiar. Soviet reconnaissance vehicles crested a low ridge, red stars barely visible beneath mud and ice. Infantry followed on foot, rifles ready, moving cautiously through the aftermath of the failed German attack. One of them spotted Sokolov trying to stand. "Comrade, over here." Hands grabbed him before he fell again. Questions flew past him. Unit? Position? Survivors? But his lips were too cracked to form answers. He pointed instead, back toward the village that no longer existed. They found the ruins by midday. There was nothing left standing. Only a crater where the house had been, edges blackened by fire. German bodies lay scattered around it, half covered by snow. A burned radio casing protruded from the debris like a broken rib. An officer knelt beside it. "This was ours," he said quietly. Engineers dug through the wreckage and found what remained of the cellar. Inside were spent cartridges, broken weapons, and 4 bodies buried under collapsed stone. Lebedev, Grigory, Nikolai, Morozov. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, the officer turned to Sokolov, who watched from a stretcher. What were they transmitting? Sokolov swallowed. "Enemy assault plan," he whispered. "Timing. Coordinates." The officer stared at him. "Because of that transmission," he said slowly. 3 divisions repositioned before dawn. Artillery was ready. The German push collapsed in hours. Sokolov closed his eyes. Not relief. Just wait. Weeks later, in a field hospital far from the front, Sokolov woke to find a notebook on the table beside his bed. Grigory's notebook. Someone had recovered it from the ruins, pages burned at the edges but still readable. Inside were frequency logs, and, between them, small lines of writing. Not reports. Thoughts. About cold mornings. About a classroom back home. About fear, written plainly, without shame. On the last page, written hours before the transmission. "If someone hears us, then we were not alone." Sokolov closed the book and wept without sound. Spring came. The war moved west. Cities fell, rivers were crossed, names changed on maps. But sometimes, at night, Sokolov still heard the hum of that dying transmitter. Still saw the orange glow of the tubes before they burst. Still felt Morozov's hand on his shoulder, asking the only question that mattered. Did it go through? Years later, a memorial stone would stand near that rebuilt village. No grand statues. No heroic poses. Just 7 names carved into dark granite, nearly lost among thousands of others. Travelers rarely stopped. But once in a while, an old man would stand there a little longer than most, cap in hand, listening to the wind move through the grass, as if waiting to hear a signal that had already been sent, and answered. The war did not end in a single day for Mikhail Sokolov. It ended in fragments, the way it had been fought. A town taken here, a river crossed there, another line on the map pushed west. By the time Berlin fell, he was no longer a radio operator. The doctors had declared his hearing permanently damaged from concussions and proximity blasts. He could still hear, but every loud sound fractured into sharp needles of pain. They reassigned him to logistics. He never argued. He had already said the most important words of his life into a dying transmitter in a frozen cellar. Everything after that felt like borrowed time. But history had a strange way of circling back. In 1946, long after the guns had gone quiet, Sokolov received a letter stamped with a military archive seal. Inside was a formal notice. He was requested to report to a review commission in Moscow regarding communications intelligence contributing to the defensive operations of January 14th. He almost didn't go, but Grigory's notebook, worn soft at the edges from years in his pocket, made the decision for him. The commission room was warm, bright, and smelled of paper instead of smoke. Maps covered the walls, colored arrows and neat labels explaining battles that had once been chaos and terror. An officer pointed to a red line on one map. "This is where the German armored counteroffensive was meant to break through," he said. If successful, they would have cut supply lines to 3 advancing armies. He moved his hand slightly. "This is where the attack failed." He looked at Sokolov. The difference between those 2 outcomes was a transmission received at 2:17 hours. Sokolov shifted in his chair. He didn't know where to put his hands. "We intercepted German communications," he said quietly. "We sent a warning." "Yes," the officer said. "You did." A pause. "Your unit was listed as missing. Presumed destroyed without action." Sokolov nodded once. "That is no longer the case." They gave him a medal. It was heavy, gold-edged, polished to a shine that felt almost obscene compared to the mud and blood he remembered. He accepted it because refusing would have dishonored the others. But when he left the building, he didn't look at it. He looked at the sky instead. Clear, blue, silent. He hated skies like that. Years passed. Cities rebuilt themselves from rubble. Children played in streets that had once been trenches. Factories rose where ruins had stood. The war became chapters in textbooks, dates to memorize. But in a quiet apartment on the edge of the city, Sokolov kept a wooden box in the back of his wardrobe. Inside were 7 objects: a cracked pair of glasses, a grease-blackened wrench, a sergeant's sleeve patch, a bent rifle cartridge, a strip of burned radio wire, a folded map, edges charred, and a small notebook filled with careful handwriting. He opened the box every January, not for mourning, that never stopped, but for remembering them as they had been before the cellar. Lebedev teaching Yuri how to shave with cold water. Nikolai swearing at machinery like it could hear him. Grigory explaining poetry no one else understood. Morozov quietly checking everyone's boots before a march. Men, not heroes. Cold, hungry, afraid. Who chose to speak anyway. In the late 1960s, a group of students from a local university began documenting lesser-known wartime stories. One of their professors had uncovered a brief archival reference. Emergency signal from forward relay unit prevented enemy breakthrough. No names. No details. They tracked down Sokolov. He didn't want to talk at first. War stories had a way of turning real people into symbols, and symbols never shivered in the dark or smelled burning flesh. But the students were patient. They asked about equipment, procedures, weather, small things. So he told them small things. How the transmitter hummed differently when tubes overheated. How snow muffled footsteps better than mud. How fear made time stretch until seconds felt like minutes. He did not tell them about Yuri asking to be left behind. Something stayed his. But when they asked why they transmitted knowing artillery would follow, he answered without hesitation. Because not sending it would have meant the others died for nothing. One of the students wrote that down carefully. The memorial stone was erected the following year. Not in a capital, not in a famous square. Just beside a quiet road, near a village that had been destroyed and rebuilt so completely that no trace of the old battle remained. 7 names. Rank. Unit. Date. Nothing about heroism. Nothing about sacrifice. Just proof they had existed. At the dedication ceremony, an officer gave a speech about duty and vigilance. A school choir sang. Wreaths were laid. Sokolov stood at the back, hat in hand. When the crowd dispersed, he stepped forward alone and placed Grigory's notebook at the base of the stone for a moment, just long enough for the wind to flip its pages. Signal received, he whispered. Then he put it back in his coat. Decades later, after Sokolov himself was gone, a maintenance crew repairing the road found something buried in the ditch beyond the memorial. A rusted metal fragment. It was part of a field transmitter casing, warped by heat, half melted on one side. No one knew how it had ended up there. Maybe thrown clear by the explosion. Maybe moved by frost and thaw over the years. They gave it to the local museum. It sat in a glass case with a small plaque. Field radio transmitter, 1943. Recovered near site of emergency signal that altered the course of a major engagement. Visitors walked past it every day. Most never stopped. But sometimes, an old veteran or a curious student would pause, looking at the twisted metal, trying to imagine voices traveling through it across fire and snow. Trying to imagine 7 men in a ruined cellar, choosing to be heard one last time. History would never know their fear, only their echo, and the echo was enough.